Right, welcome back. Now, South Africa ratified the African Court Protocol. That was 25 years ago. But it hasn't yet allowed its citizens to take cases directly to the court. This step requires a declaration under Article 34.6 of the protocol, which South Africa has not made. And without it, individuals as well as non-government organizations cannot directly access the court, limiting their ability to seek justice for human rights violations. Now, making this declaration would strengthen the African human rights system and affirm South Africa's commitment to human rights protection. Mondekazi Ntshele, who is a master's candidate in human rights and democratization in Africa, joins us now then for this conversation. Mondekazi, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. I want to know if we can perhaps start right at the beginning. Let's just talk about what is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and what exactly is this protocol?
Good morning, Arabil, and good morning to your viewers. And so if we start from the beginning, is that African Charter is a treaty, a human rights treaty in the region of African continent. What it does is that it protects, it gives the mandate to the Commission to protect and promote the human rights in the African region. And so what it does is that it also establishes a court which is called an African Court under the protocol of the court. And so the court will then make a complementary measure or authority to the African Commission so that people and the African state can be able to bring the cases to the African court.
Okay, so South Africa has ratified that protocol 25 years ago, but there's a problem. Tell us about it.
So South Africa, like you said, it had ratified the protocol. It has been 25 years now since it had ratified the protocol. And so what is important about it is that South Africa was the first countries that actually made an obligation to the African Charter and African Commission that it will be part of the human rights system in Africa. And so after 1994, after democracy, that South Africa made a declaration and ratified an African Charter. But what it did not do was to give access to organizations and citizens of South Africa. So what it means is that when the state ratified the protocol and made an obligation to the Commission, is that it allows the state, the government, to be able to go to the African court against other states members to the African Charter, against any violation of human rights. And so the only way that it can make South African citizen and human rights organizations to be able to go to the African court and have access to the African court is when they have declared and put the declaration before the African court. And so what South Africa has not done in the past 25 years is that it has not given the declaration to the people to be able to access the African court.
Okay, and why hasn't it done so though? What's holding us back here?
So what happens is that there is no clear information as to why we are slacking back in terms of putting people in front of the African court and maybe to have access as individuals and human rights organizations. But what I can say is that there is a pushback around African continent. And also there is also the conversation around wanting to protect our sovereignty as a state. And so I know that some of the countries in the African states, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, which were part of the declaration and made declaration before the African court, has withdrawn that. And I think the common reason around that is because the states don't want to be put outside and to the African court and be known for the violation that they commit against people. And so I think there is a pushback from the government and the states, and also a conversation around wanting to protect the sovereignty of the state. Because remember, Arabila, is that every country has their own local remedies. Local remedies meaning they have their local courts that they can be able to access for the cases of human rights violation. But also there's a conversation around what if then the local remedies don't work for the people, don't work, maybe they're ineffective, they're insufficient, or maybe they don't work for the people. What do we do as human beings? And so that's when now the state has to go to the African court and made this declaration so that I can be able to access the court. So I think government has sort of pushing back in terms of they perhaps anticipate that people will have cases against the government. And also they know that they have their local remedies and courts in that regard.
Okay, so is there any hope of actually getting this right then and allowing access to citizens to take cases directly to the court, considering what you've just said as well, with those local remedies being so significant and governments realizing that then? Does it nullify this African Court protocol if this isn't allowed to then happen, where citizens are actually able to take cases directly to the court?
I do want to say that this conversation shouldn't start from whether we are part of the African human rights system. I think the conversation should start from what do we want to build as an African continent? Because I know Thabo Mbeki in the African Day, they spoke about putting Pan-Africanism into place and building this continent. And so for me, I think it's important to start from the beginning and start from the African human rights systems. And so it doesn't matter whether we have our courts in the countries, but what it means is that can we build this African human rights systems so that it can work for the entire continent and be able to have our African human rights system working for us. And I mean, if you remember, Arabile, is that South Africa took Israel to the ICJ against Palestinians. And so if we can do that, why can't we be able to do it within our African continent? I mean, if you remember, we have wars in South Sudan. There's also a war in DRC. And so why can't we be able to take our people and take our government accountable in our region, in our African court? And I think it is possible for us to do that. But I think also there's sort of trust issues that we have amongst each other as African continent, and we're trying to push back, especially for South Africa, because South Africa is known of championing socioeconomic rights within the continent. And so for me, if then we are known for that, why can't we keep that energy and put ourselves into the regional level where we can be held accountable, where the rule of law can be held accountable, and also other countries can be able to learn from us, and also we can learn from them. So I think there is a possibility of it working.
Yeah, in a global context, is something like this actually happening? Are we the first ones to really champion it as Africa, of course, with its own issues, as we've made note of in this conversation, but is this something we see happening globally, whether it be in Europe, the Americas, Asia, etc.? How does it work in those regions?
I mean, there are other judicial bodies in the country, in the world, where you find inter-American human rights systems. There's also a European human rights system. So African human rights system is for the African continent. And so we are working sort of equivalent to other human rights systems in the country, in the world. So you find inter-American human rights system, but also there's also European human rights system. So we are in the right pace in terms of trying to adhere to the international standards, but also we are pushing what we think is necessary and considerate for our continent.
Yeah.
And so there is some of the regions and human rights bodies.
Is the credibility of the African Court Protocol at risk here?
It is. I mean, if you then look at how, like I said, if you look at how the states now are trying to push back from the declaration, not allowing people to be able to access the African court, there is a sort of trying to make the African court not legitimate to the people. But also my conversation is that we are the states that wants to build human rights systems that are working for the African continent. And we are actually championing rights for humans in the continent, but also we don't allow people to have access to justice in the region. So I think there is a sort of danger in that and a risk that we are playing in that regard.
Yeah, this is actually very interesting as well then. And the big question mark is whether we can get it done. So who's going to be responsible for ultimately making this happen a little bit more than Mondekazi? Who leads the conversation? Who is it that actually has to be at the forefront to get this done?
I mean, so you will know that in human rights spaces, most of the time, the people that are in the forefront of making things happen or move agendas of this nature is that we need a political will. We need a political will. We need a parliament in front. We need the ministers of justice to sit and have a discussion around whether we want to maintain our status in terms of protecting and promoting human rights in South Africa. And so there's a political will that needs to be done. But also, I think within academic space, I mean, organizations as well, they can take this agenda forward. What we are doing at the University of Pretoria right now is that we are working towards advocating for this declaration in the African continent. And so that's where it starts. But who needs to be taking it in forefront and maybe put the declaration? We need the political will in this country. We need the parliament to know and understand why do we need this declaration to be made in front of the African court. And so I think if we can have a political will and the leadership that really understands what does human rights protection means in the African continent, I think that can make it happen.
Mondekazi, thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it there as well. I think what a lesson. What an interesting conversation, I think, indeed. And it's really more than just about ourselves. Really, the continent's question marks as well around this basis, so important as well. And thank you so much for helping us understand this.